so funny. Like, I remember having blood surgery 2 years ago, just like a chick. I just think of that as just like such a great, innocent time. Yeah, it's so much inspiration. I think I found joy in this one, just like short my own just to push him a little bit, like make him sweat. But it's fun.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening and welcome to the National Press Club. My name is Thomas Burr. I'm the Washington correspondent for the Salt Lake Tribune and the 109th president of the National Press Club. I'm glad you could all join us tonight, especially given the traffic outside. We're here to discuss the 2016 election. You might have heard a little bit about that over the last 18 months. Our panelists here tonight will take a deep dive into what the news media got right and wrong in covering one of the more challenging campaigns in recent memory. The news media has been assailed from the right for targeting Donald Trump, and on the left for giving him too much airtime to spout his sometimes baseless arguments. The media were either in bed with the Hillary Clinton campaign or harping on her too much. Such is the life of journalism. Then there was this whole fake news thing and the impacts of social media. There's a lot to get into. We've had a couple changes on our panel tonight. Republican National Committee Chief Strategist Sean Spicer couldn't be with us. He's in New York heading up the Trump transition. NBC News national correspondent Peter Alexander is in Cincinnati tonight covering Trump's victory tour. We still have an amazing panel. Thank you all for being here. And let me introduce them. From your left, Chris Moody is CNN's politics senior digital correspondent. He formerly worked at Yahoo News and the Daily Caller. I met him as an intern, we were just discussing, so you've done very well there, Chris.
He was the only one who's nice to me as an intern.
So I hope I got his vote. Lindsay Walters is the Republican National Committee National Press Secretary. He previously worked on Mitt Romney's 2012 presidential bid. Margaret Sullivan, a media columnist for the Washington Post, will be our moderator tonight. Margaret was previously the public editor of the New York Times and the chief editor of the Buffalo News. Mike McCurry is the co-chairman of the Commission on Presidential Debates and a former White House press secretary under President Clinton. And Abby Phillip, a reporter for the Washington Post who spent 14 months on the trail with Hillary Clinton and previously worked for both ABC News and Politico. Thank you all for being here. Margaret, over to you.
Okay. So this is how we're going to do things tonight. We're going to have some discussion, which I will lead for a while, and then I have a feeling that this crowd could ask some pretty good questions of their own. So we will go to questions, and I'll say in advance that those questions will be welcomed, but we would ask for the Twitter version of the question, kind of short and sweet, so that we can move directly to answers. So a little bit of recap of the campaign, and we're going to start with Abby. Abby, you were essentially an embed with the Hillary Clinton campaign for the past 14 months. Give us a little bit of overview of your first day on the trail and the last day, and give us a little perspective on what you experienced.
Oh, that's hard. I'm having a hard time remembering my first day. My first day was pretty early in the campaign, and it probably would have, at that time, this was late fall, and none of the candidates were really traveling with their press corps, so we would all just sort of be traversing across Iowa or New Hampshire kind of on our own, and so most of those days it would just be, I do remember coming to Des Moines for the first time and actually finding it to be a really lovely place. If you haven't been to Des Moines, it's really nice. And the great thing about Iowa is that all the streets are kind of like north and south and east and west. So it's really easy to drive around in Iowa, and you can basically get from one end of the state to the other in 3 hours. So I did a lot of those, 3-hour trips, from Des Moines, to one end of Iowa to the other end of Iowa and back again. And toward the end, I'll just skip to the end because that was a little bit fresher in my mind. That was probably one of the longest days I've had on the campaign trail. It started at around, I think, 6 a.m. in the morning, and we got on the campaign plane. This was the final swing when Hillary Clinton was finally doing these really intensive days of 3 or 4 states. I think that day we had gone to North Carolina and Pennsylvania, and we began, I think we began that day in Florida. It was a beautiful day in Fort Lauderdale Beach. And then we ended it in Miami at 3 o'clock in the morning. And the next day I was planning to go back home to DC because I basically had a 24-hour window before I had to be somewhere else. So I wanted to go home and change out my clothes. So I had a 6 a.m. flight. So I checked into my hotel, I put my stuff in there, and I closed my eyes for like 30 minutes, and then I checked out again, and I went home.
And you said you actually really enjoyed the whole experience.
I did, because the campaigns are grueling, but it's kind of a team effort. You're like all in it together. All of the reporters from different news outlets, the campaign staffers. I mean, those final weeks were just the moment when everyone was just kind of like leaving it out on the table. And there's very little subterfuge, because you're just kind of like trying to get through. Everybody's working 22 hours a day. Everybody's really exhausted. Those last nights on the plane, that night, we all were getting home at an ungodly hour. But someone pulled out a karaoke machine on the plane, and we tried to figure out how to do karaoke, which didn't really work out that well. And, it's the last few times everybody's going to be together, and you're all kind of falling down from exhaustion. So you just enjoy it.
You look like you've survived very well. So Chris, I want to ask you about a specific thing that you did during the campaign, which was you kind of broke off from the bubble and went off to Real America for a while. Tell us about that.
Well, CNN had the election pretty well covered, both campaigns, every aspect of it, and they decided that it would be a good idea to have someone not talk to the campaigns or talk to experts or strategists or professionals for a month beforehand and see what your conclusions are. And so I went with a CNN crew. We had a kind of like a Winnebago kind of thing that we traveled from New York City to Las Vegas over a period of a month. And we visited Republicans, Democrats, undecided voters, and it was incredibly eye-opening. First of all, with the undecided voters, in a normal election year, they're undecided between Obama and Romney, candidate A, candidate B. These were not how people who said they were undecided described themselves. They were not undecided between the candidates. They were undecided about whether they could stomach voting for either one. And we heard that over and over and over again, that people were wrestling internally. They might lean conservative, but they had incredible reservations about the Republican candidate, or they were progressives, but Hillary Clinton's business ties just were far too much for them. And up until the point of Election Day, they could not say what they were going to do. They were really struggling, and it wasn't like the I'm fake struggling so I can get on TV thing. Like, this was a real internal debate. Another takeaway, I think, from it was talking to fed-up Donald Trump voters. We visited the U.S.-Mexico border in Arizona and talked with private border ranchers who live on the fence in Arizona. And basically, long story short of that is that the border strategy right now that the United States has is it keeps people from the cities and puts them to the rural areas. The rural areas are where the ranchers live. And they have been living with a daily deluge of people coming through their yards every single day. Hundreds of people, it happens a lot. So it didn't matter to them what Donald Trump said on a hot mic to Billy Bush. It didn't matter what he said about this or that. They had been asking Washington, they'd been asking Congress to fix a problem for 30 years. And I'll repeat it. Thank you, Siri. People had visited their ranches for years and said, we'll do something about it. They heard in Washington people saying they'd fix the problem, and no one did. And they said, you know what? I don't care what other thing this guy, Donald Trump, stands for. He's different. He's change. What do we have to lose? And I think you can expand from that, not just for border ranchers, but for a lot of people. The white working class that was a big part of this campaign, people all over the country that have not seen their government working for them. And I'm not saying that Donald Trump will necessarily work for them, but they certainly they would express they had nothing to lose. And I think that trip, when I came back, I was in New York for election night. And to be able to watch the election results and be far less surprised than a lot of people. I was surprised. I thought Hillary Clinton would win because of the shape of the map and the Obama coalition that he had put together. I thought she would pull it out. But there wasn't the shock, because I think I had spoken to so many people who kind of gave me perspective I didn't have had I not taken that trip.
That's great. Chris, I know that you weren't making policy at CNN, but there's been a lot of discussion about the amount of unfiltered early coverage that Donald Trump got, particularly from CNN. I'm sure you've had to field questions about that and have thought about it. Can you give us your thoughts on that?
I'll defer to Jeff Zucker, who answered a question about this just recently, and he said he regrets doing the empty podium camera and having unfiltered rallies for Donald Trump, that we just let him talk for 30 minutes. You didn't know what he was going to say. He was probably going to make news. One thing that he did not apologize for is putting Donald Trump on camera or on the phone whenever he wanted to do an interview. Here you have the candidate who's leading in the polls, who is interesting to a lot of people, and he's open to do interviews. Anyone who's worked in TV news knows that every single show has a team of bookers, and when someone's running for president, you call every candidate and say, would Mr. Carson, would Mr. Cruz, would Mr. Bush like to come on the show? So many times, all of them said no, 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 rejected every interview. You know who didn't was Donald Trump. He said, okay, you're on tonight. And I think the candidates learned, and the media, of course, learned a lot of lessons about that, about accessibility to the media.
Lindsay, talk about the role of data at the RNC and how that played out differently in this campaign than it has in the past.
So after 2012 and the loss, Chairman Previs decided to make an investment in a permanent ground game operation, which came with it a data operation. He invested millions into building an in-house data operation where we were going to look at voter scores to determine where our voters were, what we needed. And so heading into that final 72 hours of the Get Out the Vote effort, we were able to sit there on Friday and look at where those voter scores were and see that President-elect Donald Trump was within the margin in many of these key states that he needed to win in order to become the president. And what we saw there was it was going to be a matter of, can we go out and capture that unallocated vote? Can his message resonate with those voters? And can our ground game get the voters to the polls to cast their ballot on that day? And so that's what we saw heading into those final 72 hours, was the impact that voter scores had, and not just looking at the polls, because the polls at that point were close, but had showed Secretary Clinton winning, not President-elect Donald Trump. And yet, based on our voter scores, we knew what he needed to get of the unallocated voters in order to be able to push him over that threshold. And that's exactly what he did. And so we found that those scores, looking back, were able to put us very close. We were able to predict turnout in certain states. We were able to say the number in which we needed, and all of our numbers aligned very closely with what the end result was. And this was based off of data, and this was the data that the campaign was using to determine where they needed to go. They obviously we provided them data. They made the ultimate decision as to where they were going to send Mr. Trump, but we were able to give them this data based off of these voter scores, which is a deeper dive. They look at everyone's voter files and what your habits are, and they look to see, do we need to pay one visit to you, or do we need to knock on your door every Saturday? And what's going to get you out to vote? Can we get you to early vote? Are you going to go on election day? What is the topic that's concerning to you? And this is all done through social media, door knocks, through several different platforms in order to reach that voter.
So are you saying that you were not surprised?
I think we knew that we were within the margin. We knew on Friday what he needed to capture. And it was a matter of, can President-elect Donald Trump go out there and his message resonate with these unallocated voters? And will we be able to get enough of those unallocated voters to push him over the threshold? And so
Were you personally surprised?
Personally, I said all along that nothing had gone as logic would say. I joined the RNC in January. There were 17 candidates at the time. I was with Governor Rauner, who was a very bright spot in the Republican Party, a stable, came into an environment where there were 17 candidates. And all along, as you watched the primaries, different outcomes came out differently than what the media was saying, what you thought. And so all along, my view of it was, he can absolutely do this. And two, from the data, we saw that. And we saw that all the way through, these voters who no one wanted to account for, that they were going to show up.
Okay, good. Mike, I feel like I just want to ask you to unload your head in general here. I hardly know where to start.
Well, I'll start with, in a presidential campaign, and I have worked for President John Glenn, President Bruce Babbitt, President Bob Kerrey, so I know the feeling to lose, but I also know, how much work and hard work goes into it. So I appreciate, what you're saying. Like you don't know whether you're going to win or not, and you have to work hard, believing that you will win. And the Republican campaign had to work under the predominant media meme that they were not going to win, and that must have been very, very tough to do. And so you got to give some credit to the work that they did at the end of the day.
Yeah.
But
What are your big picture
my
thoughts?
big picture thoughts are we are going to have to reconstitute some common ground in the center of American politics, because it's badly fractured right now. Democrats are completely still searching for some reason to believe that this didn't really happen, so they're doing the recount thing, which is a waste of time, but they're doing it, or some of them are doing it, and I think we can talk about that. And the Republicans are still, I think, some of them astonished that they won, but where are the people in between who are going to constitute some kind of governing center in our system? Paul Ryan doesn't control the House Republicans, because he will have to get Democrats to support anything that President Trump wants to do. Mitch McConnell certainly doesn't control the Senate, because he doesn't have 60 votes. So there's no center right now in our politics. And if we want to have any progress on issues that presumably many of you care about in this room, we're going to have to reconstitute politics in this country, and it won't happen unless we get away from tweeting at 6 a.m. in the morning and doing crazy stuff.
Who leads the way on that? Who ought to lead the way on it?
Well, the
What
president.
sort of person?
The president has the bully pulpit. Mm-hmm. And we need a president who steps up to the fact that he has got some responsibility to act in a dignified manner now. And that requires a different sort of behavior than what we have seen. And he's capable of it. I'm not saying that he won't do it, but we need a different tone of and quality of vocabulary and communication and politics moving forward here, because we can't go on just doing the same kind of tit-for-tat polarized debate that we've had. That would be enormously damaging to our little experiment in American democracy.
Abby,
And end of sermon.
No, it's all your points are very good. Abby, a lot of people feel, and pretty much everybody feels, that the media kind of missed the boat on this campaign. What are your thoughts about that as someone who was in the middle of it? And that there's no suggestion here that you did anything that contributed to that. It was, I think, a lot of it had to do with polling. A lot of it had to do with interpretation of polls. Explain that to us as best you can, as someone who was on the inside of it.
I definitely have been thinking a lot about this, as we all have. I think one thing to keep in mind, just generally, is that an election is an election for a reason. We don't know what people are going to do until they walk into the ballot box and they cast their votes. So what happened throughout most of the campaign was, I think a lot of attention was paid to the polls, as I think is pretty typical. And the polls were saying certain things that may or may not have been accurate. We don't know. They're snapshots in time. But in the final weeks of the campaign, things happened. And that's what happens in campaigns. Things can change in days and in weeks. And I think that Republicans and Democrats would acknowledge a lot changed in this campaign in the final 10 days. It was incredibly dramatic, in part because there was a large population of undecided or uncommitted voters out there. And that had a lot to do with two deeply unpopular candidates on both sides. It had a lot to do with the profound negativity of this campaign throughout. And when you have such a large swath of the electorate, upwards of 12, 13, 14% of the electorate virtually undecided, that means literally anything can happen.
That's right.
So
Talk. You mentioned that things happened and always happen and did happen. One of the things that happened was James Comey's, coming out and saying that, essentially reopening, although I guess we can't use that word, the investigation. Talk to us about how that was received, what it felt like, what was the tenor.
Well, as a Clinton campaign reporter, the email situation is like it was always like a slow burn. It was always there in the background. And the day that the Comey letter happened, I was not traveling with Hillary. One of my colleagues was, and they were on the plane, literally on the plane in the air when this letter came down, and I was in the newsroom, and the letter happened, and we all kind of read it and we were like, what does this mean? And I think that was the prevailing sentiment for several hours after the letter came into existence. People just didn't really know what it meant because it was very vague. There were not a lot of specifics in it. But speaking for myself, it was very clear that no matter what it meant, all it meant essentially for the purposes of the election was that in the last 2 weeks of the campaign, the email issue, which it was always kind of like on the back burner, on low, was suddenly going to be on the front burner. And whenever you put an issue that is contentious like that in the front of voters' minds, it has an immediate impact. I mean, people start to think about it. There are a lot of voters, Democrats, Independents, Republicans, who are deeply uncomfortable about just the existence of this issue. And it was clear to me that no matter what happened, it would reignite those feelings and thoughts in people's minds. And ultimately, I mean, I think there are a lot of disagreements about what the empirical impact of that letter was. But I think everyone can agree that that it was something. It was a shock. It was a stimuli in those final weeks, and it gave the Clinton campaign. The folks that I've talked to, they talk a lot about the feeling of kind of like going through a slog in those last couple of days, the draining of momentum in the crowds, just the feeling of increased uncertainty at a time when they were trying to build a crescendo toward Election Day. And on the converse side, when you talk to Republicans at that time, that was around the time that the Trump campaign made some big decisions to, throw the long ball and go to Wisconsin and go to Michigan and make some really big plays that I think now, in retrospect, we can look back on and say may have made the difference in a really closely fought contest.
But that didn't have a lot to do with the Comey letter. It had more to do with enthusiasm and what people were really
the
excited
Trump
about.
decision, or
Yeah. I mean.
Well, I mean,
I think the
would
Comey letter is.
I would
was
say
pretty
that
much bogus at the end of the day. It was really about who was enthusiastic about their candidate.
But
and
Mike,
their-
I think you'd have to say that it affected the way people were feeling, and it pushed people in one direction.
It certainly diminished enthusiasm for Mrs. Clinton's campaign.
Yeah.
But there were a lot of other reasons for that, and it wasn't because the FBI guy sent a letter.
Well,
I would actually agree with that. I mean, I don't. I think that the Comey letter is like a lot of things in campaigns. It's just one more thing that exists out there.
I agree with that.
And it could have been something different.
If there'd been tremendous enthusiasm and if everything had been going really, really well, perhaps it wouldn't have made.
Yeah, I mean,
it
it literally could have been anything else. But but I mean, we were going into this campaign with Donald Trump consistently bringing in massive crowds in stadiums and auditoriums. There was an organic nature to his support that made it possible for him to make bigger gains in short periods of time. It's just harder for her to do that when she was running a different campaign.
Lindsay, I know just as Chris is not responsible for the programming on CNN, you're not responsible for some of the things that happened during the campaign, but Donald Trump, without question, was very antagonistic, to put it mildly, toward the press throughout the campaign. You know, how do you see that going forward? How do you see that changing, if it is going to change, the relationship between the president-elect, soon-to-be president, and the press, which he has maligned throughout the campaign?
Absolutely. I think you saw last week and President-elect Donald Trump make a step in the right direction. He met with the New York Times, who was one of the biggest critics of him through the entire election cycle. He's also sat down with the networks as well. I think it's important to President-elect Trump, as well as the administration, that they do have an open and transparent administration and a good working relationship with the media. So I think you're going to see a continuation of that pattern of the administration reaching out to the media and ensuring that there is an open and transparent and a healthy relationship there, and that relationship we saw during the election cycle and some of the contentious points, that's put behind us, and we move forward and focus on the fact that he is now the president, and he's going to be he is our world leader, and that's what's going to happen. So we're going to need to focus on that, and he's going to move forward with that and making sure that his relationship with the press isn't as contentious. And I think those steps, as I said earlier last week, of meeting with the networks and sitting down with the New York Times, who is a major critic of his, is a good step in the right direction.
It'll be good to see how that plays out.
Like move forward from his tweets from the other day about CNN, like a tweet. I mean,
I
is
think
that like we're starting the clock like the other day?
No,
like,
I think it's not. There was a lot that happened over the election
It's
cycle.
not her
There were a lot of
fault.
different
I know, I'm
points.
sorry.
It's not her
No,
fault.
I completely
I mean,
understand.
come
There were a
on,
lot
let's
of
be
different
real. Do
points, and
you think he's really going to try to have a good relationship with the
I do,
working
and I
press
don't,
and
but I
the
don't
White
think
House?
it's going to
I mean,
happen
seriously.
overnight. I do, I absolutely do, but I don't think that it's going to happen overnight. You're not going to change a behavior in one step. It's going to take time, and those meetings with the Times as well as the networks was a step in the right direction to move forward. And in order to move
They
forward,
were
you've got to
awful
take
meetings,
a step.
according to reports. They
Well,
were
you-
like
I
not. They didn't satisfy anybody on the
But
media
the fact that he
side.
was willing to sit down and have an on-the-record conversation that was an hour long, you've got to give the credit there. And it's a step. Again,
Well,
it
the
doesn't
TV
fix overnight.
meeting was not on the record. The New York Times
New York Times was.
and
And
it was not a very conducive.
It's going to be an ongoing
conversation.
process.
It will be an ongoing process. that's
So,
for sure.
Chris, one of the things that a lot of people complained about, and I think rightfully so, was that there was so much emphasis on personality and on weird events and very little discussion of issues. Is that because viewers and readers really don't want to read about and hear about the issues, or is it a failure on the part of the media or of the candidates? You know, why were we not delving into things more deeply and you know, particularly I think into the economy, which could have really made a difference for Hillary Clinton? She never really went there, or not very much. I think Donald Trump was tapping into it, but not in a detailed way. What's your read on that?
It's a really good point, and I think it's a correct one, that policy is often overshadowed by sexiness and by, you know, we saw today, Fidel Castro died over the weekend. And by Monday, we're talking about a Donald Trump tweet. And it's as though we, you know, our coverage has shifted, not just CNN, but national coverage has shifted from this incredibly monumental, although inevitable event with Fidel, to Trump tweeting about the American flag. It reminds me a little bit of kind of how things have changed, I think, a bit. In 2012, I remember there was a period in the campaign trail where I had a chance to be one of the first to interview Paul Ryan when he was announced VP. And there was severe pressure on me to take that opportunity to make sure to ask him a question about health care for senior citizens and Medicare policy. And that was like the hottest thing that happened to me in 2012. And the most exciting thing. And I remember that intense pressure to ask that policy question. And I'm not sure that that kind of, that was there as much as it was here, because there were so many shiny things for us to look at. There is something to be said about Donald Trump's ability to shift the focus of the nation and the media to what he wants it to be. He is exceptionally good at that, and he's manipulated tools that is fully within his right. I think it's also within our right to choose how to respond to them. I think there are times where we can say, okay, we can ignore the tweet for now and talk about this monumental policy shift or this big important issue.
Or I think acknowledge the tweet and maybe even write a story about it, but it doesn't have to drive the news cycle.
Driving the news
you
cycle,
know?
yeah.
So
Because like this trip that I went on before the election, meeting the people that Washington policy has a direct impact on will make you want to cover policy more, because you see how these people's tax bills are going to change, how their lives are going to be changed. As we've seen with the outpouring of Black Lives Matter, how policies really do affect people's lives. And it does matter who is not only at the top, but also in government in multiple levels. And in some cases, it could mean life or death, or it could mean eternal harassment your entire life or not. And I think we should, I agree, I think we should spend more time diving into policy. But does
we
that
always say
click?
that.
Does that get the view? I don't, that's an endless, right?
Okay.
Can I
Conflict.
just add
Sure.
on that real quick? Just one phenomenon that happened throughout the campaign, and I expect to continue in Trump's presidency, is that he makes really important and major policy decisions on the fly, on Twitter sometimes. And it's often, you know, he'll come out with whatever that policy is and not provide more details. And we need, as the news media, to find a better way to deal with that, because I think we can't have a policy of ignoring. I mean, certainly you cannot ignore the president's statements, and I think we need to treat Twitter as if it is the president making statements. And when he does that, we have to acknowledge that, but also press for more, because the details really matter, for exactly the reason that Chris outlined, because within those details lies actual human beings' fates. And you know, for example, when he this past week talked about the attack at OSU, at Ohio State, and he talked about the perpetrator, who was an asylum seeker, a refugee, and seemed to expand his position on Syrian refugees to a broader bank of refugees. And that's a really important thing. There are a lot of people in this country who are refugees and who want to know what their fate will be in a Trump administration. I think we as reporters owe it to Americans and to people who live in this country to not ignore that when it happens, and to find out more, and to explain it to them, and to press for details, and to press for answers about the seriousness of things that are being said, because it's not irrelevant, and it's particularly important when it's now. I mean, it's not Donald Trump the candidate anymore. It's Donald Trump the president-elect, the soon-to-be president of the United States.
Well said. So, Mike, as a member of the debate commission, how would you assess the debates, the most watched debates ever, or some of them at least, and what would you change? Do they need changing?
They were broadly popular. We had the largest audiences that we've ever had, but they also conferred legitimacy on a person that probably should not have been elected president. So I live with that sin.
But what do you think could have been? How could that have been different?
The Republicans could have nominated someone else.
All right, but that's
I think going off of that point, the one thing that we, as the committee, got hit over and over again for is during the primary process, it's completely up to the voters. There was no way for the RNC to be able to tip the scale one way or the other. It's completely
That's
up
too
to.
bad.
But that's, everyone wants to say the RNC, the Republican Party. It was up to the voters. This is what the voters across America
I agree.
wanted. This is the candidate they wanted. And then, largely, we now have Donald
Right.
Trump as the president-elect.
So anyhow, we had 3 good debates. I mean, I'll open up to what you guys think about it. I think they were very informative. They were very entertaining. I mean, I've had 2 big suggestions since the debates. One is, let's have a squelch button so that when someone's talking, the other person can't talk over the other person. Maybe that's a good idea.
this crowd likes it.
The other thing is, like, you know, hold them accountable to actually answer the question that's posed. That's not really our role. The Commission on Presidential Debates, we set the stage. You know, our job is not to elevate one candidate over another
The
candidate.
moderator can do that.
The moderator, we picked the moderators,
Right.
and I thought the moderators did a pretty good job. I mean, I don't have any fault with the way they engaged the candidates. I think they were tough on both candidates equally. I don't think there was one, you know, Trump came after me and my co-chair, Frank Fahrenkopf, at one point and said we were biased and it was all rigged. But You know, I don't think it was. I mean, I'd ask you guys what you thought. I thought it was a pretty fair
In
and
terms of
balanced.
the choice of the moderators?
Well, no, I think just moderators and the format and discussion and everything that happened. But I thought we got good glimpses of character, which these debates do. Most people don't watch these debates to decide who they're going to vote for. They pretty much know which candidate they support. They're looking for signals about why do I support that candidate, or what's the program that's going to go. I wish there had been more coming out of these debates now in retrospect that would have defined a governing agenda for the country going forward, because now we're kind of in a miasma of chaos right now about what's going to be the program going forward. But you know, I think there are the big question, and you know, if any of you are Gary Johnson or Jill Stein supporters, the big issue that we had to deal with is when do you let third-party candidates come into that process? And we set a threshold of 15%, and that was like heavily litigated. And I think we'll probably look at that. But I thought, you know, I thought in balance, I thought, you know, I'm interested in what the audience here thinks. I thought they were informative, they were entertaining, they were certainly engaging and
There was
dynamic.
a whole debate about whether the moderators should be fact checkers.
No, that's not their job. That's not their job. You know, if a candidate says something that's factually untrue, the opponent is the fact checker. And that, you know, it's not the job of the moderator to get in there and try to take sides one way or another, because that actually has happened from time to time, and the moderator very quickly gets called out and castigated for doing something like that. So
Should there be some kind of real-time fact checking?
there is. I mean, all the networks do that. I mean, we provide the content, and then all of the plethora of media organizations can do fact-checking and dial groups and up and down and who's winning the debate. I mean, that's not our job to interpret the content. It's the job of us, of we, the commission, to set the stage, pick the moderator, get the candidates there, get them to agree, which, by the way, is not a given. We went from 1960 to 1976 without any televised presidential debates because candidates, you know, scammed the system. So the fact that we have institutionalized debates now, that's a pretty good achievement.
Yeah.
But our job is to set the table, let them have the content, let them do their debate, and then let the American people decide what they think.
So I think we ought to take some questions from the audience. So how about over here? There is a roving mic, or you could just shout.
Okay,
Bill, you want people to use the mic for? Yep.
Hi, Rachel Oswald. I'm a Capitol Hill reporter. So this election has brought out like a lot of soul searching for me and many other journalists in the audience, I'm sure. On the way here, some friends who are not journalists were asking me, well, why did the media, you know, play up the Comey letters in the last few days, you know? And like personally, I felt like, you know, to me it was a due diligence story. It might not have needed quite the press coverage it did, but I've always felt like it's not our job to decide we're not going to cover an issue. You know, I thought it was important to cover Clinton seriously and to probe her background and to probe all the crannies. My friends were being like, yeah, but now Trump is president. So I guess there's a question for us about, I mean, false equivalence, confirmation bias. These were issues I was aware of, but now I'm thinking they're so much more important than I realized before. And when you have those issues, what is our role as a profession, and how do we cover Trump going forward, and how do we cover the next campaign in 4 years? I truly don't know what the answers are.
So is that a question?
I'm looking for wisdom, please. Yes, what are your thoughts? I mean, does the press have to change the way we treat certain stories? Should we have not given the attention to the late-breaking Comey letter that we did, if it did in fact tip the scales and it turned out to be a non-story?
Well, the Times only put 4 stories above the fold that day. I don't think it was. I don't think it was all that big a deal, Abby.
I don't think this is any different from any other issue of judgment that we face in the media. I'm not suggesting that we got this one right necessarily, but we always have to decide how much oxygen do we give a particular story. And I mean, I would argue that a letter from the FBI director, the chief law enforcement officer in this country, pertaining to the major party nominee for the presidency is a pretty important story, and we cannot ignore that story. The question is, what did the letter say and how significant was it? The problem in that day was uncertainty, and sometimes in uncertainty we go too far. And I can't speak for other news organizations. You know, I know that in our newsroom, we were trying to figure it out, just like everybody else. The letter was sent to congressional committee chairman, and so it was not explicitly a public letter. It was technically, sent privately to those people. And so in order to find out what it meant, we had to talk to sources in the FBI and on the Hill to try to probe more. And that takes time. It took us many, many hours to get to a place where we felt like we understood what was going on, the context of the letter, what emails they were even referring to. In this media age, the letter dropped and we needed a story within 15 minutes. And that, I think, is probably the bigger challenge that we're facing, is that we have to make editorial decisions in split seconds. We have to send out push alerts that say something. And sometimes we have to do that with imperfect information. So I think it will lead to mistakes. I think that over time, the coverage got better. I think everyone would acknowledge that. But in those first few hours, I mean, we as the media are fallible, and we have to make these decisions every day, and we have to rely on imperfect sources to make those decisions. And I just think in the last 2 weeks of an election, a letter like that is newsworthy.
Well, there's no question. I think there's no question
about
it's
that.
newsworthy. I guess it's a question of emphasis and prominence. Mike, you seem like you want to say something about this.
Well, you know. You're blaming me? I don't think
We
so.
all have cell phones, I guess.
Not me.
I left mine on
Mine's
the
up
chair.
there.
All right.
So it's me or Margaret.
So
Look,
I guess
I will. This is a larger subject, and I don't want to distract from the purpose of this conversation. But you know, journalistic enterprises are economically challenged now. They are not doing particularly well. Whether we're going to have the Washington Post and New York Times surviving to report on this is a open question, because they're just not delivering what people want. Now, people want the excitement, the zestiness that they get from the internet, but part of the problem in my mind is there is a built-in competition based on speed. You all, as journalists, were taught to get the scoop, to break the news, to get the fastest out there. That's not what we need right now. We need depth, substance. What is the accurate information that we can rely upon? If the Washington Post has to wait a day or two to get the story right, so what?
Oh, come on.
So
That's
what?
completely unrealistic.
You think it's completely
we can't-
It is
unrealistic?
completely
But I'll tell you
unrealistic.
something, that's
Well, if
what
you
we
want to
need.
see the Washington Post go out of business, it ought to wait 2 days
Well,
to report
if,
that.
if they
Let's
became
move on.
the substantive, place that we could go on, and 100% of people relied upon the factual things and not believe it's some liberal rag.
Well, I think waiting a couple days to report that story would have been a huge, huge mistake.
Well-
But
And I
that's
think,
my
and
view.
actually,
They would have
arguably,
gotten it right
We
and got
would
it
have
in
been-
perspective.
Let's go to this gentleman here.
CNN 2 days ago ran a piece on how Donald Trump is influenced by Alex Jones. They ran it after he was elected. They knew a lot of the things that Donald Trump was saying. Basically, they showed where Alex Jones said it. There comes Trump saying it. And
Right.
the latest one was a flag bet. And why wasn't that done earlier to show the conspiracy theorist, Alex Jones, being a big influence on Donald Trump?
Well,
We read that story.
we did have that. I mean, I know that the Washington Post wrote stories about Alex Jones and how Donald Trump had said you're a remarkable person, and he's the guy who thinks that Sandy Hook, the massacre at Sandy Hook, was a hoax. So I haven't surveyed the landscape, but I know the Post wrote that story a couple of times.
I think it's difficult to argue that there were stones left unturned before the election. Of course, there's going to be new angles and things that we take on stories, but there was a lot of critical coverage of Donald Trump. And at the end of the day, people decided to vote for him despite having that at their disposal. A lot of people follow Jones? Well, yeah, they do.
But I think
but
even
Yes,
going
go ahead,
back
Lindsay.
to the other, there was, looking at what we were looking at and the data behind it, there was no moment for Trump voters where they clicked and all of a sudden it went up. He was making a gradual increase all the way through Election Day. So it wasn't as if when that letter dropped that all of a sudden we saw a spike in scores. It was a culmination of a bunch of different circumstances that happened all the way along in situations that got to where we have President-elect Donald Trump as our president. And so we saw an increase in his support heading all the way into Election Day. And it was just a matter of where he ended and his message resonating with the voters when they went to go cast their ballot.
Did you guys think it was like they weren't buying Hillary, and it was like they couldn't accept Hillary, so they were trying to move towards Trump
I think
eventually?
we saw
Or
all
what
along,
did you see in the polling?
So what we saw all along is that the overarching theme was Hillary Clinton they viewed as dishonest, untrustworthy, and as you mentioned earlier, both candidates were largely unpopular.
Right.
And so they saw a candidate who was the status quo, and they were unhappy with where the country was, and they viewed Donald Trump as a change agent, and they were willing to take a risk on a change agent because they didn't want a continuation of the Obama
So
administration.
they bought that change, buying him as the element of change,
Yes, that
really
he was the
increased
outsider, that
in the
he was
last
going
weekend.
to shake up Washington, D.C., that he was going to
Drain
you
the
know,
swamp.
They believed that Donald Trump was going to be a president for them and not a president for himself. And that's how they viewed it. And so you just saw a gradual increase.
Yeah.
I'd like to take this question right here.
I just thought everyone would be interested that the Washington Post just sent out a news alert that there was a shouting match at the Harvard between the Trump and the Clinton team, where Jennifer Palmieri was in tears.
Well, Abby
and-
just came from there, so she could give us the
Really
inside
missed
scoop.
it.
But
She left that to come here.
Actually, I just wanted that as
We
a
can have our own
newsflash.
shouting match.
But I think that you should address the fact that the media doesn't have as much power as it used to. We are not gatekeepers. Even if people would have gotten the story about Comey letter, even if the Washington Post had held the
course.
story for 2 weeks,
Yeah.
so
That's true.
or 2 days. But so I think let's talk about social media and how people get their news and information.
Well, now that the embargo is lifted from that session you just mentioned, I'll just relay one of the main issues that came up in some of the sessions. This was a conference of the campaign managers for both sides, on actually all sides, so not just the two final campaigns, but all of them throughout the campaign. And a common theme was that the Trump campaign viewed their candidate as someone who had mastered the art of using media, both traditional media and new media, to disseminate information directly to his supporters. And I think that most people would agree that that's true, that Trump's use of Twitter and his use of traditional media, including television, cable news shows, radio, Alex Jones has a popular radio broadcast that's listened to by a lot of people, was pivotal. It was essential to his ability to have unfiltered access to voters. And there's a lot of debate about whether or not that should have been the case, but I think everyone realized too late that what was happening there. And traditionally, candidates, and certainly Hillary Clinton had this strategy where you sort of husband your candidate. You decide selectively where they go, and you kind of like make sure that the environment is perfect and that it's a sit-down interview with George Stephanopoulos or a 60 Minutes, the lighting is perfect. And that's usually how it goes. And that's usually the best way to do it because then you can control the message. But what Donald Trump did so effectively was actually the opposite of that. He just picked up the phone and he called. And he would phone in to Meet the Press on Sunday morning, virtually every Sunday morning for a long time, phoning into some of these Sunday shows and having a constant presence in the media that was free. It cost them nothing, virtually, to do that. And it meant that millions and millions of people, virtually every day, had direct access to a candidate. And Trump's aides really do believe that that was incredibly important. It is one of the features of their candidate, partly because he's an entertainer. He's
he's good at it.
He's good at it. He's the host of The Apprentice. He knows how to do this stuff, and he did it with a great degree of skill. And it was interesting to hear from other Republican candidates who really didn't realize that situation until the very end, and also realized that it didn't work for their candidates. They couldn't necessarily have Marco Rubio phone in to Meet the Press on Sunday morning for a couple of reasons. One of them being that he would always be asked about Donald Trump, but it was a major dynamic in this race. Why didn't she? Well, I mean, Mike is probably the best person to answer that question.
It's not Abby's fault.
Well, Hillary Clinton never had that approach to media.
You have to have a message.
She never had that approach to
You've
media.
got to have a vision for the country, and you can sort of stay off of Meet the Press and stuff if you've got a compelling argument about the future of the country. I don't want a quick story. In 1996, when her husband was running for re-elect, we had like a lot of debates back and forth about what's the message, and Bill Clinton got very frustrated because he couldn't define what the architecture of his argument was for 4 more years in office. And finally, after the Republican convention where Bob Dole said, "I want to be a bridge to the past," he then lit up and said, "I want to be a bridge to the future." And so we got the bridge to the 21st century. So we had our advanced people building bridges, and he would walk across the bridge, and he talked about the bridge to the future and the bridge to the 21st century. But he had an architecture for a message that had some vision in it that would inspire people to believe, here's where we'll be 4 years from now or 8 years
And you're
from now.
saying she didn't have that.
I don't think Stronger Together gave us a
Okay, I would like to
strong
take
vision.
this gentleman's question right here.
First, quick comment. I hear an awful lot of what the media didn't do wrong and not a lot of discussion about what you did. But my question is, I've seen a word cloud where on Hillary, the coverage of Hillary, email was 2 inches high. The coverage of Donald Trump, bunches of little things, but nothing 2 inch high. How do you do balance?
Well, I think this speaks to the false equivalency question that we had over here. And I don't know, Chris, do you want to take that on?
Sure. In the beginning, with the email question, she struggled so mightily to answer it properly, to give us a sense that she was being honest about it. And so she kept getting asked about it because she wouldn't answer. I think one could argue she wouldn't answer until she was severely felt like she was forced to. And these questions about the email kept dogging her. With Donald Trump, I think you see so many little things because he continually talked about so many different things, and he would answer questions about so many different things and happily talk about them. And I want to point out on the interviews where he called in, like Rubio didn't want to be asked about Trump. Well, Trump didn't call in for softball. He got railroaded on a lot of those, and then he came back the next day, and he was happy to play that rough and tumble game. And I guess not every candidate is able to do that, but he certainly was. But you know, there was some email fatigue, certainly, but I think she could have put it to bed a lot earlier, even before the campaign began. And I think that with the WikiLeaks emails that came out, there was back and forth about this with the Clinton campaign about why didn't we figure this out and get it, you know, off our shoulders earlier.
Why didn't they, Mike?
Why didn't
she put the email thing to bed earlier? And you know, I know you may not know the answer, but how would you theorize?
It's hard for me to do this because I know the personality so well, but it is hard for the Clintons to believe that anyone would attribute mal motives or mischievous motives to them. They think that it's self-evident that they act in the interest of the American people and that people would understand that. And so their presumption is that most people would discount anything that raises questions about their own integrity and their own truthfulness and willingness. So when she says, you know, here's what happened on the emails, the assumption is that people will understand that. And they don't understand perception and the perception of negativity. So.
Who else? Yes, right here.
Yeah, my question is to Abby, because you're with Hillary Clinton. There's been a number of reports that I've seen that her campaign was particularly disorganized, especially towards the end. And I'd say all campaigns are disorganized, but like there was a report that she had spent a lot of money the last 3 weeks advertising in Omaha and nothing in Wisconsin or Michigan. And there was, you know, there's been a bunch of, I don't know if those reports are true as such, but that the money was, she had spent twice as much money as Donald Trump, but it was spent in non-productive ways, like it wasn't focused in a way that was really going to move the ball toward the goal line. Did you see any of that sort of thing?
Well, so let me just tell you what did happen in terms of where the money went. So in the final weeks of the campaign, one of the reasons they did spend money in Omaha, 2nd Congressional District, the Nebraska's 2nd Congressional District, there's a single electoral college vote at stake there that is detached from the rest of the state. It was an opportunity for them to pick it up, potentially. It's a little bit more of a liberal place compared to the rest of the state, at least. And so they had actually been consistently spending money there throughout the latter half of the campaign for a while. In the final weeks, they began spending money in Wisconsin for the first time in the entire campaign. And the same was true of Michigan. But at the same time, they were also making at least an effort on the public side to expand into places like Arizona, which is a normally Republican state that they thought they had an opportunity to expand into. Now, the challenge is that, like I said earlier, the final couple of weeks of the campaign, there's a lot going on, and spending decisions about when to go up on television need to kind of be made in advance. So they made the decision to go up on the air in Arizona at a time when they thought they had positive momentum going into the final weeks of the campaign. It turned out that was short-lived, and that they ended up having negative momentum, but the money was already spent. It's sort of a sunk cost at that point. And by the time they realized they were losing momentum, they scrambled to pour money into the upper Midwest, into Wisconsin, into Michigan. And by then, it was too late. I mean, the Wisconsin and Michigan decision, so Wisconsin came about 10 days. That was before, actually, the Comey letter. They realized they were losing some momentum there. About 10 days before the election, they decided to spend money in Wisconsin, and then 7 days before the election, they began spending money in Michigan, which goes to show how last minute some of those realizations were. So yeah, there are some people who said, why the heck did they spend money in Arizona? I mean, I think they, in retrospect, are looking back on it and wondering why they spent money in Arizona too. But you know, once they made that decision, it's hard to pull it back. And but I will say that they had a lot of money going into those final weeks. They weren't like pinching pennies necessarily. They were putting money into places making strategic decisions based on what they thought they knew. It's just that in politics, things change really quickly.
Okay, we're going to have to
Let me ask
wrap
a
it
quick
up.
question. When do you think they realized that they were in a lot worse position? They weren't expanding the map. You know, Arizona was, you know, that was a fiction. When did they realize that they had to consolidate?
I would say 7 days before the election. When they,
So
by the
a
time
week
they,
out.
Yeah, I mean, by the time they were spending money in Michigan, Michigan was a dire situation, and
Right.
and it had not been prior to that point. So Michigan is sort of like, it's the canary in the coal mine. Once you're having trouble in Michigan, it just means that you're probably going to have trouble everywhere else in that part of the country, and that's exactly what happened.
Yeah, my youngest son goes to University of Michigan, and so we were out there for Parents' Weekend, and there was nothing on the air, and then like a week later, all of a sudden,
It's just an avalanche of ads.
they suddenly realized. So there was a late.
Trump went on the air.
Okay,
Very
I'm
interesting.
sorry, we have a million other questions, but I'm supposed to wrap this up. We're actually a little bit late. Thank you very much. Great questions. Thanks to a great panel, and I think we can continue this.
Well, that's really interesting. The Michigan point is really, really interesting.
It's sort of
I mean, Michigan was.
You know, if